Oh, we're back. I should probably stop my music. This is ridiculous. Okay. Um, yeah. So yesterday, we did the introduction in chapters 1 through 4 of um, the 51 Day War by Max Blumenthal, and it wasn't a waste of time by any means because we had tons of people watching on Twitter. Um, we didn't get a lot of people watching on Instagram, which was not Instagram, on Facebook, which was disconcerting to me because, um, a lot of the people I thought might be interested in listening to the book didn't see the stream, and that's not through like any fault of their own. That's through the fault of the fact that my Facebook account is sanctioned to high heck. Um, as I was telling Instagram at one point, I think, that my account has been sanctioned on Facebook ever since I posted a photo of people attending Hassan Soleimani's funeral, because I guess they consider him a terrorist, which is insane because he like literally defeated ISIS. So, but it's Facebook, so you got this fucking billionaire doing his little flag waving, whatever the hell that is. So there's no surprise there. But today has been absolutely crazy in the news. They killed Jovenel Moise. They yelled that they are the DEA right beforehand, um, which is like, it gets you thinking, right? Because we don't know the full story yet, obviously, but we do know that, like, at least I believe that, like, yelling "We're the DEA" before you're gonna kill a head of state is, that's CIA behavior, right? Because you think about what's gonna happen, right? Everyone gets pissed. They were doing their uprising in Haiti for some time now, and now you've got this like death hit squad, whatever, coming in and like killing this guy. Now maybe people in Haiti are happy that he's dead, um, but my guess is there's some of that and some of like, well, we wanted to do this our way. We don't want Western countries interfering with our um, development of governance, I guess. So you think that like maybe people are going to get upset about this, and in Haiti itself. And I was watching. I stepped outside my room and had the misfortune of hearing Chris Cuomo speak, which is always unfortunate. But this time he was saying, that if it gets bad enough, the U.S. is going to have to go in. So like there it is. Like this is the U.S. government playing the long game. They're thinking things will escalate. They're thinking things will get worse now that Jovenel Moise is dead, and that'll give them the pretext they need to go in and invade Haiti and install a different dictator, possibly very significantly escalate the situation of violence and suffering in Haiti, um, which is something that nobody wants except for the U.S. government, obviously. Um, but I figured I'd talk about that. So we're on Instagram now, we're on YouTube, Twitter, we're on Facebook, and Twitch. I had back from my video gaming days, I had a affiliated Twitch account, so I figured I may as well use that. And if it seems like I'm in a good mood, it's because I'm kind of psyched about my setup right now because I went out and bought this thing. Um, And now all I really need is like an actual microphone, like one of those fancy ones that like stick out or whatever, and a second monitor. But we'll get there. For now, we're gonna pick up where we left off yesterday, which was we finished the introduction in chapters 1 through 4 of the 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza by Max Blumenthal. Maybe I can, I want to change my title to Ruin and Resistance in Gaza because it does not include that, but it should. But whatever, we'll do that next time. If people are listening, they'll figure out what this is about pretty quickly. So I'm not gonna like go on and on and on before I start reading to you. We're gonna jump right into it, as always. Chapter 5, A Thin Red Line. As the day of August 14th wore on in the ruins of eastern Shujaiya, I began to sense that I was inside a vast crime scene. Dan Cohen, Abba Razek, and I visited almost a dozen homes occupied by Israeli soldiers in Shujaiya, wading through rubble and piles of shattered furniture in search for clues into the Israeli plan of operation. I found floors littered with bullet casings, sandbags used as foundations for heavy machine guns, sniper holes punched into walls just inches above the floors, and piles of empty Israeli snack food containers. In the stairwell at the entrance to one home we visited, soldiers had engraved yet another Star of David. We would find these in vandalized Palestinian homes across Gaza's border areas. In a nearby house, soldiers used markers to scrawl in mangled Arabic, "We did not want to enter Gaza, but terrorist Hamas made us enter. Damn terrorist, Hamas and their supporters." That's a quote. A wall in another home had been vandalized with the symbol of Beitar Jerusalem, the Jerusalem-based football club popular among the hardcore cadres of Israel's right wing. Below the Beitar logo was a slogan, "Price tag." The phrase refers to the price settlers seek to exact on the native population of the occupied West Bank each time one of their illegal outposts is demolished or a settler is attacked by Palestinians. Over the past decade, the attacks have grown in frequency and spread into Arab neighborhoods, in core Israeli cities, with racist graffiti appearing on Palestinian Christian churches and businesses. The appearance of price tag-style vandalism during the war in Gaza coincided with the 45% plunge in price tag attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank, leading an Israeli army official to speculate that, quote, solidarity within the army, end quote, had provided an outlet for the violent impulses of Jewish fanatics. In each home the soldiers had occupied, we found crude maps of the immediate vicinity etched on the walls. Each house was assigned a number, possibly to enable commanders to call in air and artillery strikes ahead of their forward positions. Names of soldiers were listed on several walls, but were mostly covered with spray paint upon the troops' departure. I learned later, through several Israeli friends who had served in combat units, that these were shooting schedules that determined who would be a sniper on duty and when. In the ruins of a second-floor bedroom, in an empty ammo box under a tattered bed, a group of local men had discovered two laminated maps of Shujaiya. They eagerly handed them over to me, hoping that I would be able to make sense of them. I was immediately able to determine that the maps were photographed by satellite at 10:32 a.m. on July 17th, just days before the neighborhood was flattened. The date in the upper right-hand corner of one map was written American style, with the month before the day, raising the question of whether it was a U.S. or Israeli satellite had captured the image. The U.S. National Security Agency has routinely shared information with Israel's Unit 8200, a cyber warfare and surveillance division embedded within military intelligence, according to journalist James Bamford, writing for the New York Times. Outlined in orange was a row of homes numbered between 16 and 29. Homes immediately to the west were labeled with arrows indicating forward troop movements. And there's a picture that I will show you briefly of, I will try to show you briefly of, nope, that's not the right thing. Here, sorry, hold on. There's a picture attached to this that I want to show you. So this is the satellite image that the author Max had taken. And you can kind of see that in Instagram as well, right there. So continuing. I need to find a better way to do that in the future. Not a lot of books have a ton of illustration though, so I don't know. It's hard to do like a screen share thing considering I'm using multiple devices. But continuing, a local man who had accompanied us into the house pointed at the homes of the map outlined in orange, then motioned out the window to where they once stood. Every single house in that row had been obliterated by airstrikes. I looked back at the map and noticed the dusty field we faced was labeled in Hebrew, quote, soccer field, end quote. Devised at least 2 days before the assault as an apparent guide for invading soldiers, the map sections Shujaiya into various areas of operation, with color-coded delineations that were difficult to decipher. After the war, Aran Efrati, a former Israeli combat soldier turned anti-occupation activist, interviewed several soldiers who participated in the assault on Shujaiya. Quote, I can report that the official command that was handed down to the soldiers in Shujaiya was to capture Palestinian homes as outposts. End quote. Efrati wrote on his Facebook page, quote, from these posts, the soldiers drew an imaginary red line and amongst themselves decided to shoot to death anyone who crosses it. Anyone crossing the line was defined as a threat to their outposts and was thus deemed a legitimate target. This was the official reasoning inside the units. End quote. Months later, when we met in Brussels to present testimony on Israeli war crimes in Gaza at the Russell Tribunal, Efrati helped me decipher the map I had found. He pointed me to a red line drawn on the map that bisected Shujaiya from east to west. It was labeled in Hebrew as Hardufim, or dead people. Efrati explained that while the term Hardufim was often called out through Israeli army radios when a soldier was killed and required transport from the theater of battle, the word was also used to mark free fire zones in the Gaza Strip, where soldiers could kill people regardless of their involvement in battle. Efrati was a veteran of Operation Cast Lead in Gaza in 2008 to 2009 and had personally witnessed the delivery of this order. In Operation Cast Lead, as we covered yesterday in a little detail, you can find information on an action Nevadans for Palestinian Human Rights has done recently to feed the houseless population in Vegas in memoriam of Operation Cast Lead, which killed 1,400 civilians, including 350 children. So definitely check out Nevadans for Palestinian Human Rights and everything we're doing. The killing fields is the next section of this chapter. The day in mid-August at the eastern edge of the, quote, soccer field, now occupied by tents and surrounded by demolished 5-story apartment complexes, I encountered a middle-aged man wearing an eye patch. Introducing himself as Mohammed Fathi al-Arir, he led Dan, Ebba, and me through the first floor of his home, which was now a little more than a cave furnished with a single sofa, then into what used to be his backyard, where the interior of his bedroom that had been exposed by a tank shell. It was here, al-Arir told me, that 4 of his brothers were executed. One of them, Hassan al-Arir, was mentally disabled and likely had little idea he was about to be killed. Mohammed al-Arir said he found bullet casings next to the victims' heads when he discovered their decomposing bodies days later. Just next door lived the Shamali family, one of the hardest hit clans from Shujaiya. Hashem Shamali, 25, described to me what happened when 5 members of his family decided to stay in their home to guard the thousands of dollars of clothing and linens they planned to sell through their family business. When soldiers approached the home with weapons drawn, Shamali said his father, Nazir, emerged with his hands up and attempted to address them in Hebrew. He couldn't even finish the sentence before they shot him, Shamali told me. Quote, he was only injured and fainted, but they thought he was dead, so they left him there and moved on to the others. They shot the rest, my uncle, my uncle's wife, my 2 cousins, they shot them dead. And of course, this is a true story from when Max Blumenthal and Dan Cohen traveled into Shujaiya. These are, for those of you unaware, these are actual accounts from what happened during the 51-day war. They entered during a 5-day ceasefire. So, continuing. He couldn't even finish the sentence before they shot him. Shamali told me he was only injured and fainted, but they thought he was dead, so they left him there and moved on to the others. They shot the rest, my uncle, my uncle's wife, and my 2 cousins. They shot them dead. End quote. Miraculously, Shamali's father, Nazir, managed to revive himself after laying bleeding for several hours. He walked on his own strength toward Gaza City and found medical help. Quote, someone called me to tell me he was alive, Shamali said, and I thought it was a joke. In December 2014, Dan Cohen located Nazir Shamali, who recalled for him how he managed to escape the shooting gallery of Shujaiya by navigating through his neighbors' destroyed homes, flagging a taxi and finding medical treatment at Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. He confirmed that he had been shot in the left arm while addressing the Israeli soldiers in Hebrew. He added that his family had no idea who was alive until he had phoned them from the hospital. On July 20th, Hasham's 23-year-old cousin Salam Shamali returned to his neighborhood at 3:30 p.m. During the temporary ceasefire to search for missing family members alongside members of the International Solidarity Movement, the ISM. At the time, Salam's parents had no idea he was in the neighborhood. As Salam waded into a pile of rubble wearing jeans and a green t-shirt with the ISM volunteers just meters away, who were clad in neon green vests identifying them as rescue personnel. A single shot rang out from a nearby sniper, causing his body to crumble to the ground. Now, there's actual footage of this in the documentary Killing Gaza. You see this man be shot alongside these rescue workers. So you can find Killing Gaza on YouTube for free from Behind the Headlines and Gray Zone News. So, continuing. At the time, Salem's parents had no idea he was in the neighborhood. As Salem waded into a pile of rubble wearing jeans and a green t-shirt with the ISM volunteers just meters away who were clad in neon green vests identifying them as rescue personnel, a single shot rang out from a nearby sniper, causing his body to crumble to the ground. As Salem attempted to get up, another shot struck him in the chest. A third shot left his body completely limp. Apparently, he had crossed the red free fire line. The incident was captured on camera by a staffer at Gaza's medical media ministry named Mohammed Abdullah. International broadcast news outlets reported on the startling execution. Israeli military spokespeople were strangely silent. Back in Gaza City, where survivors of Shamali's family had taken shelter in a relative's apartment, Salam Shamali's sister and cousin received the link to the video in an email from a friend. In the course of 3 minutes, they watched Salam die. They knew it was him because they recognized the sound of his voice as he cried for help. This is a photo in the book of Amina Shamali, who is crying after having seen her family members be murdered. And you can see this over here, and you can also see this over here. The next section is called Missing Salam. In an apartment in central Gaza City, in the central Gaza City neighborhood of Ramal, I met the parents, siblings, and cousins of Salem Shamali. They had been forced to relocate here after their home was completely obliterated by the Israeli tank shells and drone strikes in Shujaiya. The apartment was crowded but impeccably clean, a far better arrangement than one of the squalid UN schools where most of their neighbors lodged with little to no privacy. Salem Shamali's father, 62-year-old Khalil, said that the family had evacuated Shujaiya at 8 a.m. As soon as they had reached safety, they realized Salem was missing. Quote, "It's impossible to put into words how difficult it was," Khalil Shamali said. Quote, "We waited for 2 or 3 days, not knowing, and when we found out, it was difficult to handle. I have had to call on God, and He helped me." End quote. The attacks on Shujaiya continued for days, making it impossible for the Shamali family to retrieve Salem's body. They beseeched the ICRC for help, but after so many attacks on their vehicles from the Israeli army, which had declared all of Shujaiya a closed military zone, they were unwilling to approach the area. Salem's father, Khalil, still believes his son might have been saved if he had been evacuated right away. When Salem's family finally retrieved his body, they found it badly burned, almost unrecognizable, and tossed dozens of meters from the location where he had been killed by subsequent bombardments. The death toll had reached such unbearable levels he could not be buried in Shujaiya, where the cemetery was overfull. When the Shamalis finally found a place to bury him, they had to open a grave that was already occupied because the cemetery was so full. During my visit with the family, Salem's cousin, Hind al-Katawi, whipped out a laptop and played for me a clip of the report on the killing by NBC's Ayman Moyeldin, by Ayam Moyeldin, who was NBC's person. Al-Katawi had wanted to demonstrate for me the international impact the incident had made, but instead, by playing the video, she summoned barely submerged emotions back to the surface. As soon as the clip of Salem's killing began to play, his mother, Amina, sobbed openly. Quote, "The real problem is not just losing your home in the bombardment," Mohammed al-Katawi, Hind's brother, told me as Amina Shamali brought a wad of tissues to her eyes. Quote, "The problem is you have lost your future, you lose your hope, and you can even lose your mind. 2 million people here are on the verge of losing their minds." End quote. He handed me a packet of pills that had been prescribed by local doctors to family members diagnosed with varying degrees of depression. Deprived of justice, they had been given antidepressants to numb their despair. Among those suffering was Salem's younger brother, Wasim. The slightly built, sad-eyed 14-year-old recalled his brother as a bright accounting student who paid for his education by working in his father's corner store. He was one of his best friends. Quote, "We used to go out with him whenever we were bored, and he used to take us places," Wasim said. Quote, "Now he's gone, and there's no one else to fill his place." End quote. Tears suddenly came streaming from Wasim's eyes. He covered his face with his hands and shook with sorrow. While his mother Amina, the grandmother, cried, the rest of the family sat in uncomfortable silence. After our interview, I approached Wasim again and asked him what he wanted to be when he came of age. He replied without pause that he planned to join the resistance. A look of intent had replaced his desolation. Wasim told me he had not considered becoming a fighter until the war came down on Shujaiya. That was chapter 5. This next chapter is called Bloodlands. And attached to it is a photo of the ruins of Kuza'a's main water tower and Abad al-Rahman Mosque, which were both destroyed with high explosives by the Israeli military. So you can see this on a few platforms over here. And you can see this over here. I do apologize that that's not a good viewing quality. Bloodlands. Once a bucolic farming town of about 14,000, Kuza'a is situated just a short walk from the kibbutzim that lay in Israeli territory. The only thing that separates the two populations are kilometers of concrete walls, studded with remote-controlled machine guns, and a buffer zone that makes the surrounding farmland inaccessible. For 2 decades, the farmers of Kuza'a have been subjected to relentless violence from the Israeli army stationed around the kibbutzim. First, with the razing of their citrus and olive trees, and then with sniper fire when they attempted to harvest their land. The buffer zone imposed on them had been used as a pretext to destroy the farming that serves as the town's single productive industry. But even after years of continuous violence, nothing would have prepared them for the horrors visited on them during the 51-day war. As the Israeli Army's Golani Brigade wrapped up its assault on Shujaiya on July 22nd, the Israeli Army rolled waves of troops from the Givati Bridge into Kuza'a and declared the town a closed military zone. This meant that thousands of terrified residents were prevented from escaping. Media was forbidden from entering the town, and the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, which insisted on coordinating with an obstinate Israeli military, was not able to get its ambulances inside the cordon. For 10 days, the pastoral town became the setting for the worst atrocities of the war as the Gazan borderlands were transformed into bloodlands. At the helm of the Givati Brigade was Colonel Ofer Winter, Colonel Ofer Winter, a religious nationalist officer who was emerging as one of the most revered military figures in Israeli society. Days before the invasion of Gaza, Winter distributed a motivational letter to his troops, later published in the Israeli paper Ma'ariv. It perfectly reflected the apocalyptic messianism coursing through the ranks of the new generation of Israeli military officer corps. Quote, "History has chosen us to be the sharp edge of the bayonet of fighting the terrorist enemy from Gaza, which curses, defames, and abuses the God of Israel's battles," end quote. Winter wrote this to his troops. He later continued, "I turn my eyes to the sky and call with you, hear, O Israel, the Lord of our God is one Lord. God, the Lord of Israel, make our path successful, as we are about to fight for your people, Israel, against an enemy who defames your name," end quote. Impelled by their commander's call to punish the infidels of Gaza, the soldiers of the Givati Brigade rolled into Kuza'a on July 22nd. The brigade was accompanied by an engineering company that used giant Viper mine-clearing devices in Kuza'a's outlying neighborhoods. The Viper consists of a towed mobile launching pad that propels a 2 meters long barrel filled with C4 explosives into open fields, triggering the detonation of the mines planted across a wide swath. In Kuza'a, however, the explosive-laden barrels were fired into the center of densely populated neighborhoods with devastating effects. Multiple residents complained to me of, quote, barrel bombs that left the interior of their homes charred, with plastic furniture and ceiling fans were left looking melted. The Givati Special Forces were aided by a tank unit that barreled around Kuza'a's perimeter, indiscriminately firing into the town center and pinning residents down as they tried to flee to the west. Shelling from the tank position was rampant, flooding the town with 120 millimeter shells, while the Air Force bombarded civilian homes with missiles. Under cover from heavy fire, the Special Forces troops took up position on rooftops, sometimes with bound and blindfolded Palestinian men as human shields against possible guerrilla raids rather. On July 22nd, the day now known as Kuza, now known in Kuza as Black Tuesday, the Israeli Special Forces accosted Khalil al-Najjar, the 55-year-old imam of the local Kuza mosque and one of the most respected members of his community. Al-Najjar was in his home when 15 members of his family after a night of heavy bombardment when a tank shell hit their house. With the house surrounded by Israeli soldiers, al-Najjar beseeched the troops in Hebrew to allow him and his family to leave. Instead of permitting them to seek refuge elsewhere, the troops seized al-Najjar, forced him to strip, and paraded him through the streets of the Kuza mosque to be interrogated, quote, making me, a well-respected man, stand completely naked in front of everyone was the most humiliating thing of my life. Khalil al-Najjar told Mohammed Amr, the Gaza-based journalist who broke the news of the imam's humiliation. At the mosque, an Israeli soldier summoned a bulldozer after discovering graffiti on one of his walls celebrating the guerrilla activities of the Islamic Jihad. After the bulldozer sent the walls crashing down, a unit commander badgered al-Najjar for information on the tunnels. You are Israeli intelligence with all of your technology, drones, F-16s, and you don't know where the tunnels are. He told Amar, he had replied, quote, do you think those who are building the tunnels are going to come and tell me where they are? Having failed to provide the soldiers with the intelligence they sought, the frustrated troops demanded Khalil al-Najjar put his clothes back on. He was then paraded back down the center of Kuza'a's main street in order to call all the young men to assemble outside. According to Amir, the soldiers had warned al-Najjar that they would shoot him and his brother if he violated their orders. Eventually, since not all of the military-aged males had emerged from their homes, the troops took al-Najjar back to the mosque along with a power generator and then ordered him to use the loudspeaker system normally used for a call to prayer to order all the young men in the town to assemble. As droves of confused young men appeared in the streets heeding the call from one of the most trusted figures in town, they were separated from women and children and abducted en masse, then taken to Israeli prisons for interrogation. According to Omir, a soldier poured water down the front of one man's pants while another threatened to burn a prisoner alive. As the lineup and abductions concluded, Khalil al-Najjar was allowed to carry his elderly mother out of town, past columns of tanks, and stunned locals who had just witnessed the respected clergyman stripped of everything, from his clothing to his dignity. Quote, I felt inside myself sorry for the imam, because he's done, Amir later testified at the Russell Tribunal in Palestine. Quote, he is the most trusted figure in town. The Israeli military has used his voice to attract the young people, and then they were trapped from everywhere by the military. End quote. After the bulldozing of the Kuza mosque, Israeli troops laid C4 explosives inside the main mosque in the town. Abed al-Rahman, from inside a tank, a group of Israeli soldiers filmed themselves awaiting the detonation of the mosque, which they claimed lay above the entrance to a tunnel. This explosion is dedicated to the memory of the 3 people who are from the battalion who have fallen since the beginning of the operation: Amit Yori of the blessed memory, Guy Boyland of blessing memory, and Moshiko Divino of blessed memory. End quote. One of the troops declared. As the mosque and an adjacent water tower went up in a ball of flames, the soldiers erupted in rapturous celebration. Quote, long live the state of Israel, end quote. One of them exclaimed. The Israeli army later claimed that the mosque contained a tunnel used by the Al-Qassam brigades, though, for some reason, the soldiers had not filmed any evidence. Quote, soldiers are perfectly entitled to be happy about destroying a tunnel used to carry out attacks against Israel, end quote. An army spokesperson told to France 24. For around 10 days, Kuza'a remained under siege, close to the outside world with thousands of residents trapped inside. F-16 missiles and tank shellings had destroyed all of the power lines, and its main water tower had been detonated. It was not until a humanitarian ceasefire finally took hold on August 2nd that the full extent of the horrors that unfolded behind the military cordon became known. Among the first journalists to make it into the town was Tamir al-Mashal of Al Jazeera Arabic. Al-Mashal arrived in Kuza as hundreds of traumatized refugees fled in other directions, many carrying decomposing bodies wrapped in blankets. The road was littered with the corpses of those cut down by Israeli tank fire as they tried to escape. Among the bodies was that of a teenage girl, killed a few meters away in front of her wheelchair. In a home at the eastern edge of town, Al-Mashal found a pile of burned bodies in a bathroom spattered with dry blood and pieces of flesh. The owner of the home, Hani Youssef Najjar, stood at the entrance to the bathroom and shook with outrage. Quote, "These men were executed in cold blood because they fought for the honor of our town," Najjar exclaimed on camera. "The house has no signs of being bombed. Were the bodies brought here?" Al-Mashal asked Najjar. "They were brought here and executed in cold blood, as you can see," Najjar replied. This next section is called The Murder Room. 2 weeks after the discoveries of the bodies, Dan, Ebba, and I met 32-year-old Hani Najjar in front of his modest two-story home. Situated in the Al-Najjar neighborhood, named for his vast extended family, his house was among a cluster of dwellings that surrounded a patio shaded with fruit trees and bougainvillea vines. Don't know if I'm saying that right. It was one of the few structures in Kuza that had not been battered by tank shells or utterly destroyed by F-16 missiles. He led me inside and showed me the bathroom. Quote, "It smells 1% as bad as it did when I first found the bodies," Al-Najjar remarked. The bodies had been removed from the bathroom, but the signs of a mass execution remained. Crimson blood and the blackened crust of charred flesh stained the white shower tile. The floor was drenched in pools of congealed blood and small piles of human hair. Embedded in the carry-on were grenade pins and the bullet shells that read IMI, or Israeli Military Industries. Najjar pointed to blood-caked knives on the floor and told me that the blades he used to slaughter his chickens were used by Israeli soldiers to kill the men that they had dragged into his bathroom. It was also possible that the doomed men had taken knives in a desperate last-ditch bid to defend themselves. "I spent 14 years building this house," Hani Najjar remarked to me, "and now I want to bulldoze it and demolish the entire house." I commented the rest of the house was intact and asked why he didn't just rebuild the bathroom. Quote, "If you were me, would you agree to come back to live here?" He responded, explaining that his top priority was shielding his young twin daughters from the trauma. "It's very hard to keep a strong mind. It's why I decided to never come back here until this whole house is bulldozed or burnt down. Then we are going to rebuild again." End quote. Najjar worked as a nurse in the surgery department in Nazar Hospital in the nearby city of Khan Yunis. Having evacuated his wife and daughters from Kuza 2 weeks before the ground invasion, he was uncertain about the identities of the men found slaughtered in his bathroom, but he thought that they might have been resistance fighters who had been taken prisoner after fighting to the last bullet. A local who led Tamir al-Mashal to the site of the execution described witnessing local fighters harrying the Israelis around the town. The men remarked that they had exacted numerous casualties on the Israelis at the edge of Al-Najjar neighborhood, suggesting that the executions might have been an act of revenge. Later in August, the Canadian reporter Jesse Rosenfeld published an interview he conducted with a fighter from the Islamic Jihad operating under the alias of Abu Muhammad, who had participated in the battle in Kuza. The veteran guerrilla told him that 6 men found in his house had intended to ambush the invading Israeli troops, but were caught in the open as they emerged from the tunnel. They retreated under heavy fire and barricaded themselves in Hani al-Najjar's home. One of the fighters, who was badly wounded in the melee, demanded to make his final stand by the door of the house, hoping that he could hold off the Israelis long enough to enable his comrades to escape. When he and his unit ran out of munition, the Israelis, quote, pulled him outside and shot him in front of the house. Abu Muhammad told Rosenfeld, quote, then they went into the house with dogs. In situations like this, there is no way for these guys to fight off the dogs. I heard their screaming and begging for mercy on the radio. End quote. It was then that Abu Muhammad heard, quote, a long burst of fire from an M16, and then silence. Escaping Kuza. While Hani al-Najjar had managed to escape to the nearby city of Khan Yunis during the assault on Kuza, much of his family remained trapped in the town along with some 1,000 others who had taken shelter there. At first, his young brother Mohammed, who lived next door with his wife, Aman, had been unable to flee. The interior of their house had been incinerated and turned into rubble. The shady courtyard outside, Muhammad Najjar seated himself in a plastic chair and described the 6 days of terror he survived. Slender and taller than his older brother, with auburn hair and a closely cropped beard, he detailed the atrocities in a flat tone that belied the fresh trauma that seemed to be eating at him. Quote, the experience I lived with will always be stuck in my head, and I will never be able to get over it, he remarked with a distant stare. Najjar said the nightmare began when hundreds of locals fled from downtown Kuza when the Israeli Special Forces landed from helicopters on top of their homes. It was Ramadan, and food was scarce. For days, the adults fasted and gave any food they could find to the small children among them. They called the ICRC again and again, but to no avail. The Red Cross was unwilling to send ambulances into the besieged town without Israeli approval. With the pangs of hunger gnawing at them and the tank shelling growing closer with each passing hour, the group resolved to make an escape. At 5 a.m. on July 26th, hundreds of besieged residents rushed from their neighborhood through the gauntlets of Israeli tanks and infantry that lay between them and the main road out. Along the way, Mohammed Najjar saw fleeing refugees fall under direct sniper fire and shrapnel from tank shells. He helped gather the wounded on stretchers and carry them towards Hamza Mosque at the western edge of town. But before the group could escape, it ran into a squadron of Givati special forces gathered around a tank for a cigarette break. That's where the humiliation started, recalled Mohammed Najjar. They were shooting directly at us, so we had to lay on the ground. We put our hands on our heads and took off our clothes without being ordered to, because that is what we used to witness on TV when you run into special forces. We kept screaming, civilians, civilians, but they didn't respond. From the tank, a soldier called out for an elderly man to step forward from the terrified group, which had huddled behind a large mound of dirt. Najjar said when the man emerged, the soldier shot him to death without explanation. Next, the soldier ordered another man forward, demanding he strip and turn around. Finally, the group was allowed to march forward behind the naked man, continuing their escape along the road strewn with dead bodies of the elderly, the weak, and those not able to escape the shells that were still landing all around. At the gates of Kuza, Najjar phoned the ICRC one final time. Once again, they refused to dispatch an ambulance, and so the march continued west until the refugees found cars to take them to the main hospital in Khan Yunis. Ultimately, Najjar escaped with his immediate family, but not everyone was so lucky. He rattled off the names of more than 10 members of his extended family who were kidnapped by the Israeli soldiers and taken to prison on the Gaza border, where they were beaten and interrogated. When we met, he said 4 were still in detention. After returning to Kuza, Najjar's wife Aman used a jagged piece of stone to inscribe a few messages on the charred walls of their ruined house. In her best English, Kuza is a symbol of dignity. My small heart can't afford more. I'll be optimistic in spite of these disastrous things. The next section of this chapter is called Alone on the Road. Every member of the Rugila family managed to survive the 10-day siege on Kuza, except one. Seated in a circle of plastic chairs in a barely furnished salon, 28-year-old Ghassan Rugila told me how his 16-year-old sister, Gadir, was left behind. As he spoke, his young brother Bilal, who wore a bandage around his right ankle, hopped to and from the kitchen on his left leg, bringing us trays filled with cups of sugared tea. Ghassan Rugila's story was almost identical to that of so many other residents of Kuza whom I spoke to. He and his family became trapped in their home when the Israelis invaded on July 22nd, were shot at each time they attempted to escape, and despite countless calls to the ICRC, begging the organization to send ambulances, were ultimately left to fend for themselves. On the day of the invasion, the family gathered, with hundreds of their neighbors, at the home of the town doctor, Kamal Khadan, who was treating more than 100 wounded patients in his tiny clinic, and would continue to tend to the rising tide of injured in the besieged town even after shrapnel from a tank shell wounded his right arm. Along with any of the wounded and elderly who could walk or be carried, the Rugila family rushed to the edge of town, arriving at the dirt mound described by Mohammed al-Najjar as a de facto checkpoint guarded by Israeli soldiers. Bilal Rugila was pushing his sister, Gadir, in her wheelchair. Gadir was capable of walking at a deliberate pace, however, she was severely mentally disabled. Ghassan Rugila told me he called out to the soldiers and asked permission to pass towards Khan Yunis, where ICRC ambulances were said to be waiting for them. The soldiers rejected their request and then opened fire. A tank shell exploded just a few meters away from the family, wounding Bilal in his leg and arm, and sending them to fight in flight for safety. As the tanks targeted the scattering crowds, the family realized they had left Gadir behind in the street. I saw the tank shoot at us, and in the face of death, we all worry about ourselves, Ghassan explained. With their neighbors falling all around them, the family retreated back into town, where they spent the next 3 days without food. Under relentless bombardment and imploring the ICRC to retrieve Gadir from the dusty road where she had been left, the Israeli forces bombarded an adjacent neighborhood. Quote, "They burned the area," Ghassan Rugila commented. The family made another break for safety. This time, they managed to reach the city of Khan Yunis. Back in Kuza, Gadir remained alone on the road in unknown condition. As before, the family's calls to the ICRC, begging them to retrieve Gadir, yielded nothing. The organization was unable to gain Israeli permission to approach the town. On August 2nd, when a 72-hour ceasefire finally took hold, Gadir Rugila was found by refugees who had been streaming out of the village. She lay dead 6 meters in front of her wheelchair, crumpled along the side of the road, filled with shrapnel and completely decomposed. The teenage girl had apparently attempted to chase after her fleeing family before an Israeli tank fire cut her down. Left behind in the chaos, she bled to death alone. Gadir's family carried her body 3 kilometers to a cemetery and buried her in a hastily dug grave. While lowering his sister to the ground, Ghassan Rujela said the Israeli drones fired 5 rockets into the graveyard. No one was injured, he explained in an understated, chillingly clinical tone. But it was very, very difficult, especially after not being able to see her for 11 days. This is a photo of the Star of David, spray painted by Israeli soldiers on the walls inside the USAID funded school in Kuza. This next section is called A Window into Hell. Spending the day of August 17th in Kuza was like peering through the window to hell. But what we witnessed in the landscape of apocalyptic oblivion paled in comparison to the experience described to me by 2 Palestinian Red Crescent volunteers who had attempted to break through the Israeli military cordon during the siege of the town. 25-year-old Ahmed Awad and 24-year-old Ala al-Kusofi arrived at the edge of Kuza at the time when the ICRC ambulance crews refused to travel anywhere near the town. They said they had come to collect the body of a man whom soldiers had lashed to a tree by both arms and shot in the leg. When they arrived at the site, the soldiers ordered the driver of the ambulance, Mohammed Abadla, to exit the vehicle. When he obliged, they told him to walk 5 meters forward and switch on a flashlight. As soon as he flicked the light on, the soldiers shot him in the chest and killed him. This was an ambulance driver. It was something I'll never forget, Awad recalled. Seeing a colleague killed like that in front of me, I couldn't believe what I had witnessed. End quote. The 2 Red Crescent volunteers told me they later found a man in Kuza with rigor mortis, holding both his hands over his head in surrender, his body filled with bullets. Deeper in the town, they discovered an entire family so badly decomposed they had to be shoveled with a bulldozer into a mass grave. In a field on the other side of town, Awad and al-Kusofi found a shell-shocked woman, at least 80 years of age, hiding in a chicken coop. She had taken shelter there for 9 days during the siege, living off nothing but chicken feed and rainwater. Quote, "She couldn't believe it when we found her," said al-Kusofi. Quote, "She was sure she would die with the chickens." In nearly every shattered home I entered in Kuza, on every bomb-cratered street, in destroyed mosques and vandalized schools, I heard horror stories like this. Every resident I met in his town was touched by the violence in one way or another. While visiting the town, I wandered into the courtyard of a USAID-funded rehabilitation clinic for women and children afflicted with continuous traumatic stress disorder, a condition that affects a solid majority of the youth in Gaza. Located in a street lined with 4-story apartments pocket-marked with bullets and tank shells, the school was completely empty, but the signs of an Israeli presence were everywhere. As we entered, we found stars of David spray-painted by soldiers across the walls. Right below, colorful heart-shaped paper cutouts bearing the names of students. In the closet of an administration office that was kept neatly kept except for a few scattered papers. I found a spent M72 light anti-tank weapon. It was one of the shoulder-mounted launching tubes manufactured in Mesa, Arizona, just miles from Dan Cohen's hometown of Phoenix, by the Norwegian-owned Nammo Arms Corporation. The weapon had been used by the Israelis to rocket civilian homes across Gaza's border regions. In a class across the courtyard, sun rays burst through the gaping holes in a wall about the size of a 120-millimeter tank shell. They shone light on a series of colorful posters decorated with matching ribbons that contained motivational messages. They read, "It always seems impossible until it's done. Stay alive. Look to the future. No negative thoughts allowed." We wandered around the corner past a group of children filling a jug of water from a truck that replaced the water tower Israeli forces detonated. Past the giant dome of Abad al-Rahman Mosque, which now sat on a pile of rubble next to the toppled water tower, like the ancient ruins of some bygone empire. Nearby, we entered a small courtyard surrounded by a warren of shattered homes. At the edge of the yard, a small boy lay, impassively in his bed in a room with no walls. A ceiling fan that looked as though it had been melted dangled above his head. In the center of the yard sat a gigantic olive green barrel. It was a spent giant Viper round, one of the C4 packed mine-clearing devices the Israelis fired into the center of Kuza during the assault on the town. A hen flapped its wings next to the barrel and chased after baby chicks bouncing through the rubble. "Where are you from?" an old man called out to me from the road. He wore large spectacles and a morning robe. In his front pocket, stuffed with paper notepads, various cards, and glasses holder, he reminded me of my older Jewish relatives who came of age before the digital era and grew accustomed to carrying stacks of business cards, coupons, handwritten reminders in their shirt and coat pockets, along the assorted mints and pens. "I'm from America," I told the man, readying for an indignant response. "Ah, America," he grumbled. "I want to thank the American people," the man continued, advancing to within 2 feet of me. "They are nice people. They give us food and bread, and they give Israelis weapons to kill us. They have a different standard. It would be nice if they treated us all as humans." He introduced himself as Ali Ahmed Kuder, the father of Kamal Khadan, the doctor who treated the town's wounded under heavy bombardment and, in spite of being injured himself. Like his son, Ali Ahmed was a supporter of Fatah, the rivals of Hamas. And like virtually everyone I met in Gaza, he was an ardent supporter of Al-Qassam's armed resistance. Al-Qassam is the armed military wing of Hamas. So, despite this man being a Fatah supporter, he is also a supporter of Hamas. Quote, "Our weapons are not terrorist weapons. Our weapons are for self-defense," he insisted. "Our weapons are to free our land. We are dignified people. We love life. We don't hate life like they say, but we'll die for our land." End quote. A group of small children gathered in the courtyard. Ali Ahmed detailed to me how many family members each child lost in the assault on Kuza. Pointing at the little boy lying in bed, he suggested that the most devastating consequences of the war was not the death toll, but the psychological impact on the youngest members of his community. "That kid wants to make an atomic bomb and obliterate Israel," he roared. "Why? Because he saw his family members die in front of him. How can you raise kids who want to make bombs?" End quote. When I made my way back into the road, I heard Ali Ahmed call after me again. He was rushing forward through the rubble with a tray of sweets. "I don't mean to say that all Americans are bad," he said, urging me to take freshly baked cookies. It's just the government that's the problem, not the people. Just then, an Israeli squadron of American-made F-16s roared through the sky. A small girl standing beside me ducked reflexively at the sound of the jets, bracing for another missile strike. The war was far from over. This is chapter 7, called Human Shields. To enter the Gaza Strip from Israel, a visitor must pass through the airily empty Erez terminal. The border is managed by members of the Army's COGAT, Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, division. Young female conscripts with tightly pulled back hair seated behind flat computer screens inside small kiosks, thickly shielded with bulletproof glass. A visitor with a Jewish-sounding last name will receive greater scrutiny from COGAT administrators seeking to prevent any Jewish Israeli from slipping into Gaza for fear they might be kidnapped. Down a fenced-in corridor, the visitor arrives at a concrete blast wall. A female COGAT officer, or SOGAT officer, administrator's voice blares through a loudspeaker. Then an iron door slides open. Beyond is another long fenced-in corridor extending through the buffer zone, and beyond that, Gaza. Walking the corridor through the buffer zone, the only sound a visitor is likely to hear is a single note, lawnmower-like buzzing of an Elbit Hermes 450 drone hovering overhead. A few hundred meters to the right, a remote-controlled machine gun is visible atop a sentry tower along the walls of the Gaza ghetto. It is a component of Israeli spot and strike system, an automated weapon apparatus controlled by female soldiers in air-conditioned offices tens of kilometers away at a Negev desert army base. When one of the young desk jockeys notices a figure approaching the buffer zone whose gait matches that of a, quote, terrorist, they aim remotely, press the button on a joystick, and kill the target. As with the Israeli Air Force's drone pilots, those managing the, quote, spot and strike system, view residents of Gaza as little figures on a black and white television monitor whose lives can be turned off with the flick of a switch. At the end of the fenced-in corridor is the makeshift trailer Hamas erected in place of the newly constructed border terminal Israeli forces destroyed on their way into Gaza. Besides bombed-out structures on a road chewed up by Israeli Merkava tank tracks, sweaty men in tattered uniforms hastily examine passports, scribble down identification numbers, and wave in foreign aid workers and journalists. Though the border sentries sometimes check visitors' bags for contraband like alcohol, which is banned in the Gaza Strip, outsiders often manage to smuggle bottles of liquor past the exhausted guards. ICRC staff routinely truck SUVs full of liquor into Gaza to furnish a de facto bar the organization maintains at its compound in Gaza City. According to several friends who have patronized the, quote, bar. Beyond the Hamas border terminal is Beit Hanun, a border city of more than 30,000 that lies in the northeastern Gaza Strip. After a taxi ride through the neatly tended southern Israeli kibbutzim on the way to the border, it is a startling sight to behold. Nearly everything in Beit Hanun seems to have been flattened. Even the UNRWA school in the center of the town bears the marks of an Israeli attack that had killed 17 and wounded 200 among the hundreds of local residents sheltering there during the invasion. The ruination of Beit Hanun was merely the peak of years of continuous Israeli violence against the impoverished city. It was a frequent site of rocket launches towards southern Israeli cities like Sderot and the nearby Erez crossing, and had experienced routine Israeli bombardments since 2006. When I arrived in Beit Hanun with Dan and Ebba during the 5-day ceasefire that began on August 14, 2014, the sound of the gunshots marking the discovery of new bodies sounded in the distance. Thousands of residents had returned for the first time to the ruins of their homes to survey the damage. Among them was 55-year-old farmer who introduced himself to me as Abu Rahman. Like his neighbors, who had eked out a living in the rich soil lining Gaza's borders, Abu Rahman had lost virtually everything at the hands of the Israelis. In 2005, Israeli bulldozers razed his citrus grove to extend the buffer zone, wiping out trees that had provided oranges throughout the Gaza Strip. They then destroyed the wells he used to irrigate his land, and when they had returned that summer, they leveled his 4-story home, killing his flock of 80 goats and incinerating the 5 tons of wheat he had stored there. Bees buzzed from out of the first floor, which below 3 layers of concrete floors like a destruction sandwich. Which lay below 3 layers of concrete floors like a destruction sandwich. The only survivors of his apiary. Quote, "In the blink of an eye, everything my father worked for 70 years was gone," Rahman said. "During the past month, I feel like I aged 2 years." End quote. Unlike Shujaia, where the residents in the local markets were bombarded without warning, or in Kuza, where thousands of civilians remained in town under the assumption that they would not be directly targeted, most of Beit Hanun's population was able to escape ahead of the Israeli onslaught. When Rahman returned to his home during the first temporary ceasefire on August 2nd, however, he found the rubble of his neighbors' homes littered with human flesh and dismembered limbs. Some had not been able to escape after all. According to Rahman, several of his neighbors, Israeli troops, according to Rahman and 7 of his neighbors, Israeli troops from the Gavadi Brigade ordered the Khadan family, who lived next door to him, to remain in their home when they invaded on July 17th, warning them that if they attempted to evacuate, they would be shot. 7 military-aged males among the family were blindfolded and abducted to Israeli prisons, where they were subjected to days of interrogations about Hamas, tunnels, and guerrilla operations they had no involvement in. The rest of the family, women, children, and an old man, were then kept on the ground floor of the house for 6 days. During that time, while the Israeli army engaged in periodic clashes with fighters from the Al-Qassam brigades and other armed factions operating around Beit Hanun, it held the Khadan family in the ground floor of the house, refusing to allow them to leave as the soldiers maintained the home as a base of operations. When it appeared a brief ceasefire would take hold on July 25th, the soldiers retreated from the home, but ordered the family to stay inside. The following day, with the Wahadans still inside their home under direct army orders, the Israeli military called in strikes on the area, killing every trapped member of the family. In the course of an hour on July 26th, much of Beit Hanun was destroyed under a storm of Israeli artillery shells. "30-year-old Rami Hatim Zakai Wahadan was one of the few members of the family to survive, but only because Israeli forces abducted him at the onset of the ground invasion. When the ceasefire began on August 2nd, Rami returned to his home and searched for his family. In the rubble, he found several members of his family. Sorry, I'm going to repeat that. When the ceasefire began on August 2nd, Rami returned to his home to search for his family. In the rubble, he found severed and badly seared limbs and torsos belonging to his grandmother, Suad Wahadan, 67, her grandchildren, Zainab, 27, Sumud, 22, Ahmad, 14, and a 10-year-old Hussein, 2-year-old Gaina, and a 51-year-old Baghdad Wahadan still lay somewhere under the rubble when I arrived 2 weeks later. Their relatives were unable to locate any of their body parts. Around this time, Rami learned that his own father, his niece, and 2 other members of his family had taken shelter from the Israeli assault on Baitanun in the northern city of Jabalia on July 20th. Rami went to Baitanun on August 2nd, but could not reach his grandparents' house as the Israeli forces briefly returned to the area. There, he learned that his father and 3 other members of his family had been killed in an Israeli drone strike on their home in Jabalia on July 20th. On the street lined with the ruins of what used to be a vibrant neighborhood, friends and neighbors of the Wahadan family patiently helped me piece together the gut-wrenching details of what happened, jotting down the names and ages of each dead family member in my reporter's notebook as they described the massacre. A friend of Abu Rahman's rushed out of the house with a bunch of grapes and handed it to me along with a bottle of ice-cold water. Although it was happening again and again during the days I spent in the rubble of the homeless and the grief-stricken survivors, it was difficult to take this level of hospitality for granted. A few weeks after I reported news of the massacre of the Wahadan family, Defense for Children International, DCI, a London-based human rights NGO, a non-government organization, with an office in the occupied West Bank, managed to track down Rami Wahadan. Quote, "I cry 1,000 times a day," Rami told DCI Palestine. Quote, "I cannot and will not forget what Israel did to us in this war, and how they executed my family in 2 different incidents. They murdered my little brothers, my 2 sisters, my mother, and my grandparents in Baitanun. And they murdered my father, my niece, my brother's wife, my uncle's wife, in the Jabalia refugee camp." End quote. This next section is titled "The Survivor." When Israel's Givati Brigade began to withdraw from Baitanun on August 1st, it was still operating in Rafah, the Gaza Strip's southernmost city, which lies hard against the border with Egypt and serves as the source of the tunnel economy that has brought everything from vital food and medicines to zoo animals into the Gaza Strip. From summary executions of more than 100 local men by Israeli forces during their temporary occupation of Gaza in 1956 to the campaign of home raising the Israeli military oversaw in 2004, the 150,000 residents of this city have been exposed to decades in disproportionate violence. At Rafah's eastern edge are the ruins of Yasser Arafat International Airport, a relic of the era of the defunct and discredited Oslo Accords, the basis of the so-called peace process, that had served a minuscule elite in Gaza before Israeli airstrikes and bulldozers blasted it to smithereens. After Operation Cast Lead concluded in 2009, scavengers set in on the airport, digging concrete from its runway to rebuild their destroyed homes. Its reconstruction was one of the terms Hamas offered in exchange for a 10-year truce, an offer the US, Israel, and the Egyptian military junta rejected. This photo is of Mahmoud Abu Said beside a window in his home, where he said that Israeli snipers used him as a human shield as they sniped at his neighbors from over his shoulders. This is the photo. Continuing. One of the most violent assaults in Rafah's bloodstained history began on July 14, 2014, when Givati Special Forces, under the command of Colonel Ofer Winter, staged a limited incursion through the fallow fields around the airport and took up positions around the city's eastern suburbs. I visited the area during the 5-day ceasefire that began on August 16th, arriving via a dusty lane littered with the shards of spent Israeli munitions, which had been dumped indiscriminately on residents on August 1st and 2nd. Lying in a pile in front of a bombed-out home were shards of artillery shells, U.S.-made Mark 82 dumb bombs, drone missiles, and spent bullet casings. The calling cards Israel's military left across Gaza. In front of a warren of shattered houses whose facades appeared to have been ripped down by bulldozers, we met members of Abu Said's family. They took us to a porch of their home to talk in the shade of a red tile roof punctured with gaping holes from Israeli shrapnel. The interior of the house had been trashed by Israeli soldiers who transformed it into a base of operations. As they introduced themselves, a drone buzzed incessantly overhead while squadrons of F-16s soared by. After several minutes of conversation about the Israeli attacks, a friend of the family rushed to another house to summon his cousin. He returned with an unkempt teenager in baggy sweatpants and sweat-stained t-shirts, and a sweat-stained t-shirt, bloodshot eyes, and an almost catatonic expression on his face. Traumatized, his friends exclaimed. He's completely traumatized. 19-year-old Mahmoud Abu Said could hardly speak about what happened to him when the soldiers arrived to his neighborhood. When I asked him about the incident, his eyes filled with tears. The muscles in his face began to twitch, and his voice faltered. As a baby-faced teenager attempted to recount how Israeli soldiers used him as a human shield, torturing and then kidnapping him, he collapsed into a plastic chair. I feel so afraid, he muttered. It's not normal. I feel weak. I'm not myself. End quote. After a drink of water, Mahmoud managed to pull himself together. He then explained what happened when the soldiers arrived on July 14th, during the first stage of Israel's ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. The entire Abu Said family had gathered at his spacious home, including 30 cousins. When a platoon of Israeli troops on the dirt road outside the house, the terror began. The soldiers ordered the family to evacuate the house under the shelling their army had just initiated. Then they summoned Mahmoud's father, Abu Hadi al-Said. As soon as he appeared at the doorstep, they asked him if he spoke Hebrew. When he answered in the affirmative, the soldiers shot him in the chest, leaving him to die. This was one of several cases that documented in which Gaza residents described to me the shooting of older male relatives who had revealed their ability to speak Hebrew. Were the men shot because they feared Hebrew-speaking Palestinians might be able to decipher their orders? Were orders issued to kill them? I found no answers among the survivors of the shootings, only harrowing testimony that formed a clear and chilling pattern. The Israeli military has offered no explanation either. Left for dead, Abdul Hadi al-Said managed to get medical help that allowed him miraculously to survive. The other members of the family fled to safety in the urban center of Rafah. The soldiers grabbed Mahmoud and didn't allow him to leave. Mahmoud said the Israeli troops dragged him back into the house, blindfolded him, and wrapped him in a blanket on the floor. They began to blow holes in the walls to use as makeshift sniper slits. When U.S. troops in Afghanistan called, quote, murder holes, according to journalist Dan Lamothe. The soldiers then stripped Mohammed to his underwear, handcuffed him, slammed him against the wall, and began to beat him. With an M16 at his back, they forced him to stand in front of open windows as they hunted his fleeing neighbors, sniping directly beside him and over his shoulders at virtually anything that moved. When they were not using him as a human shield, Mahmoud said, the soldiers left him alone in the room with a muzzled army dog who was off the leash. It was on the top floor of Mahmoud's home, in a darkened crawl space, that an Israeli sniper killed two of his neighbors through a murder hole, Saleh Izrabi and Allah Abu Shabab, two young men who had attempted to flee under the intensifying Israeli shelling, were killed in front of their own homes. By the ruins of his house, I met Saleh Izrabi's father, Soliman, who told me his 22-year-old son was shot to death while attempting to rescue Abu Shabab, who he had found bleeding in the street. Israeli forces had destroyed virtually everything Soliman Izrabi owned, with a combined salvo of missiles and artillery shells. Behind him was the car his son once drove for a living as a taxi driver. It, too, had been destroyed by Israeli shells, reduced to a pile of gnarled metal. We've been suffering for more than 60 years, so this didn't start yesterday, Soliman Izrabi exclaimed. When I build a house, the Israelis bomb it. When I try to make a living, they destroy my business. When I try to raise a child, they kill him. Izrabi had managed to escape to a squalid, overcrowded UNRWA school, where they had been living for the past 40 days. Quote, the life there is shitty, he remarked. Meanwhile, Mahmoud Abu Said was removed from his wrecked home, where he had been held and taken by soldiers to a prison cell in southern Israel. In the Israeli jail, Mahmoud said he was blindfolded and taken to questioning sessions every 3 hours. Interrogators routinely beat and slapped him as they demanded information about tunnel networks and armed resistance activity. After 6 days, and in coordination with the ICRC, which arranges for prisoners to be dumped from Israeli jails back into Gaza, usually at the Erez crossing, Mahmoud said he was released back into the Gaza Strip. He returned just in time for the unrelenting 48-hour-long Israeli assault his neighbors now refer to as Black Friday. That was chapter 7. I lost my spot quite significantly. I'm unused to this software. Let me see if I can fix this. This is chapter 8. Chapter 8 of chapter 8 of 18. We'll do this last chapter and then continue at another time. Chapter 8, Hannibal. On July 31st, with morgues across the Gaza Strip overflowing and large swaths of the besieged enclave reduced to rubble, diplomats from Israel and Hamas agreed to a 72-hour ceasefire that was to begin at 8 a.m. the following day. But the U.S., which as a matter of long-standing policy, has refused to negotiate directly with Hamas, had apparently allowed Israeli troops to remain inside Gaza and be able to maneuver freely. In a vaguely worded statement, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry declared that the terms of the ceasefire authorized Israeli forces to continue its defensive operations from those tunnels that are behind its lines. Hamas had never agreed to the unusual stipulation. On the morning of Friday, August 1st, at 6:22 a.m., an hour and a half before the ceasefire was to take hold, the Qassam brigades published a report on the organization's Twitter account about a clash near Rafah. At 6:30 a.m., a group of Al-Qassam infiltrated behind enemy lines at East Rafah and bombed a house that the enemy had taken as a stronghold with a tandem missile after enemies bombed the whole area. Al-Qassam tweeted an update on the battle at 7:34 a.m., apparently with real-time information from its fighters. At 7 a.m., a group of Hamas fighters clashed with Israeli forces at East Rafah and caused many injuries and death to them. The clash began when a small deployment of Israeli troops from the Givati Brigade's elite Pulsar reconnaissance unit that included 23-year-old Lieutenant Hadar Golden attempted an incursion east of Rafah, in the Abu Ros area, occupying a local home with armored vehicle accompaniment. Launched just minutes before the ceasefire, the raid was a provocative maneuver. A group of Al-Qassam fighters emerged from a tunnel to attack the Israeli soldiers. With AK-47 rifles and tandem charge anti-armor explosive device launched from an RPG-7, they killed 2 soldiers, Major Benaya Sarel and Staff Sergeant Lael Godoni, and badly wounded Golden, whom they had attempted to spirit away through a tunnel as a captive. Givati Brigade Commander Colonel Ofer Winter immediately ordered soldiers in the area to give hot pursuit to the Al-Qassam ambush team. Lieutenant Eitan, his name was withheld by the Israeli army for unspecified reasons, lobbed a grenade into the tunnel shaft and then led 2 other soldiers inside. On the way through the tunnel, he found pieces of Golden's uniform, suggesting that Golden had been mortally wounded. The physical evidence Eitan retrieved allowed the Israeli army to declare 36 hours later that Golden was a casualty of war. Golden's personal background gave the incident special gravity. He was the second cousin, once removed, from Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon. The family tie was withheld from the Israeli public by an official gag order, while the Israeli military deployed another deception to establish political space for a major escalation in violence. Hours after the 72-hour humanitarian ceasefire was to go into effect, a tired-looking President Barack Obama appeared before the press corps in Washington, D.C. to accuse Hamas of violating the terms of the deal. Quote, "I have unequivocally condemned Hamas and the Palestinian factions that were responsible for killing 2 Israeli soldiers and abducting a third almost minutes after a ceasefire was announced," Obama said. In fact, Obama was acting on dubious information supplied to him by the Israeli military, which claimed that the clash east of Rafah took place at 9:30 a.m., an hour and a half after the ceasefire was in place, and several hours after the clashes in eastern Rafah began. Besides information published at 6:30 a.m. on Al-Qassam's Twitter feed about the fighting, more than a dozen civilian residents of eastern Rafah who witnessed the clashes and subsequent Israeli bombardment told me in separate accounts that the battle began at 7 a.m. or minutes before. Echoing the disinformation that had been fed to President Obama, Kerry declared that Hamas had committed an outrageous violation of the ceasefire. White House Press Secretary Joshua Earnest reinforced Kerry's denunciation by saying quote, would be a rather barbaric violation of the ceasefire agreement, end quote, having falsely accused Hamas leadership of orchestrating the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teens in June, and then assailing the group for, quote, purposely playing politics when it rejected the Egyptian ceasefire proposal that offered it nothing beyond a return to the status quo of siege. Kerry and the Obama administration once again provided the Israeli military with diplomatic cover it needed to escalate the violence. While the White House harumphed condemnation of the impudent Hamas, the Israeli military bombarded eastern Rafah with almost every mode of destruction available to it, from F-16 missiles to naval shelling to drone strikes, mortars, and tanks. In a matter of hours, at least 500 artillery shells and hundreds of missiles were dumped on the city, almost entirely in civilian areas. The army had activated the Hannibal Directive. Forced to pay with their lives is the next section of this chapter. The Hannibal Directive was established in 1986 following the Jibril Agreement, a prisoner exchange in which Israel traded 1,150 Palestinian prisoners for 3 Israeli soldiers. Amidst the political backlash, the Israeli military drafted a secret field procedure to prevent future kidnappings. The operation was named after the Carthaginian general who chose to poison himself rather than be held captive by the enemy. Among those who drafted the doctrine were Asa Kashir, a Tel Aviv University philosophy professor who serves as a house, quote, ethicist for the Israeli military, and developed the Army's so-called, quote, purity of arms doctrine, which governs its policies on attacking civilian targets. Kashir denied knowledge of the policy in a 2003 exchange with one of his students, but now admits its existence and has even defended Ofer Winter's decision to implement it. Major General Yaakov Amiduror, a former national security advisor for the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Israeli Chief of Staff Gabi Ashkenazi, also participated in devising the Hannibal Directive, end parentheses. Kashir has fervently denied that the official policy is aimed at killing captured Israeli soldiers. However, claiming that, quote, you cannot throw a grenade towards 3 of them, 2 abductors and the soldier, in order to abort the abduction, end quote. Yet, Amiduror conceded to the Israeli reporter Mitch Ginsburg, quote, it's a military operation to return a hostage soldier. Soldiers' lives can be risked, end quote. In 2009, the Israeli military killed Yakir Ben Melech, an Israeli citizen and patient at a mental health clinic in the southern city of Ashkelon. He had escaped and was scaling a fence to the Gaza Strip. The former deputy chief of the Israeli Army's Southern Command, Zvika Fogel, later admitted that the military had enacted the Hannibal Directive to prevent Ben Melech from being taken captive by Hamas. The Hannibal procedure is definitely the right procedure. We cannot afford now some cellmate next to Gilad Shalit, Fogel said, referring to the captured Israeli soldier whose freedom cost Israel the release of more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Within minutes of Golden's capture near Rafah, Israeli military correspondent Attila Samfalvi reported that the words, Hannibal, Hannibal, began blaring across Israeli army communication systems. Lieutenant Aitan, one of the soldiers assigned with pursuing and killing Golden, later declared, quote, I didn't give an order to shoot. I told fellow soldiers, you identify anyone, you shoot, even if it means killing Haidar. even if it means wounding Haidar. This is what you do. Painful as it is, it's better this way." End quote. Heavily edited audio recordings released in December by Army sources that were cleared by the military censor offered new details on the spree of destruction around Rafah. The possible capture of Golden had sent Lieutenant Colonel Eli Gino into a state of extreme agitation. Having not witnessed the incident, Gino could be heard in the audio frantically ordering his troops, "Go, go, go, give him another shell." Quote, "Bring a weapon whose name is excised from the recording into that darn refugee camp and send it up into the air." An unidentified officer can be heard exclaiming. "The entire mosque is full of holes. There's nothing left," another declares. As members of the Gavati reconnaissance unit opened fire with reckless abandon, as though they were reenacting an American Western gunplay, the gung-ho Gino eventually realized that the main threat to the lives was not from Al-Qassam fighters, but from each other. "You're shooting like our words. You'll kill one another. Enough," Gino shouted. Quote, "I already have dead R words. Wait a minute." I'm sorry, I'm not going to say that on stream or anywhere else. Continuing. The application of the Hannibal Directive in Gaza should have provoked widespread controversy in Israel, regardless of whether Jewish Israelis cared about the lives of Palestinian civilians. After all, it was designed to kill Israeli soldiers to spare their government the political cost of securing their release in a prisoner swap. The parents of active duty soldiers would undoubtedly prefer to have their children released at any cost, so long as they were returned alive. Yet there was little public protest of the policy's application in the Israeli media or from the parents of soldiers. The right-wing governing coalition that had rebuffed the U.S. demands to release a batch of Palestinian prisoners in the final stages of framework negotiations earlier in the year had even approved a law that effectively banned future prisoner releases. In a political landscape dominated by hardliners like Economics Minister Naftali Bennett and Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who were vocally against prisoner swaps, the Hannibal Directive was the military's only option for dealing with the possible capture of Golden. It was not just an order that the military could choose to exercise, but it had become a political imperative. One of the few Israeli public figures to protest the policy's application in Rafah was Uri Arad, a veteran of the 1973 war who had been held captive by the Egyptian military, a member of the medical faculty at Tel Aviv University, and a political opponent of Netanyahu. According to Arad, the Hannibal Directive represented, quote, "a radical change from this way of thinking that propped up the value of human life," end quote. It was a disturbing sign of the dominance of the ruthless authoritarian right wing, he argued. Now, in place of the government serving its citizens, Arad wrote in the Israeli daily newspaper Yedoth Aronoth, quote, "it is the citizens who are forced to pay with their lives in order to serve the interests of the government. This is simply called fascism," end quote. Colonel Ofer Winter, the religious nationalist commander of the Gavati Brigade, who vowed to wage a, quote, "holy war" to punish Gaza for the crime of blasphemy, claimed his forces implemented the Hannibal Directive for the sole purpose of battering Golden's captors, not to kill him. Quote, "that's why we used all this force," end quote, Winter insisted in an interview with the newspaper Yedoth Aronoth. Quote, "those who kidnapped need to know they will pay a price. This was not revenge. They simply messed with the wrong brigade," end quote. Quote, "my soldiers killed 5 terrorists out of the tunnel shaft," he claimed, referring to Lieutenant Eitan rushing into the tunnel where Golden was taken. Raising his hands to the heavens before his Israeli interviewer, Winter exclaimed, "Thank God. Thank you, God." However, the attack on Rafah, extended well beyond the fighters who attacked Golden's unit and captured him. By sundown, on August 1st, the day known in southern Gaza as Black Friday. Much of Rafah lay in ruins. As many as 121 lay dead, including 55 children, 36 women, and 5 men over the age of 60. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of those killed during the 2 days of hellish bombardment had no role in the fighting. This photo I'm about to show you is a photo of the children of the Khadan family displaying spent Israeli munitions, which they found in and around their house on Black Friday. Oop, that was loud. Continuing with this next section called No Sanctuary. On August 18th, on August 18th, day 3 of the ceasefire, I returned with Dan Cohen and Ebba Razek to the easternmost area of Rafah, where Golden was allegedly captured, and where the Israeli rampage began. It was where Mahmoud Abu Said had been taken hostage and used as a human shield 2 weeks before, and where Israeli snipers occupying the top floor of his house had picked off his neighbors. On the dusty lane where I had first met the shell-shocked Mahmoud, next to the crater of an exploded missile, his cousin, 33-year-old Nidal Abu Said, remarked to me, quote, "I've been married for 5 years, and thank God we don't have a child. I wouldn't want them to witness what we have went through here. We lived through a real-life horror movie." End quote. Nidal Abu Said and over a dozen of his family members and neighbors told me that the violence began on August 1st around 7:30 a.m. with the sound of loud explosions from Abu Rus, an area just east of their neighborhood, near the ruins of the airport. This contradicts U.S. and Israeli claims that the Al-Qassam brigades attacked Israeli soldiers after the 72-hour ceasefire was in place. Like Abu Said's family and residents across Rafah, Abu said that he had left the UNRWA shelter when the ceasefire was announced and returned to his home. When the Hannibal Directive was declared in response to Golden's capture, these civilians were like sitting ducks. Quote, "We saw every kind of weaponry directed at us," Abu Said told me, pointing to the shards of Israeli munitions scattered across the road where he stood. Abu Said told us his cousin witnessed a missile strike in the middle of a crowd attempting to flee from the Israeli bombardment, engulfing the neighborhood. "There was a large number of martyrs there," he said, claiming Israeli forces deliberately concentrated their shelling on the crossroads to prevent anyone from escaping. "They trapped us," he said. From the Abu Said home on the eastern edge of Rafah, we traveled closer to the city center to meet more survivors of Black Friday, where we arrived at the home of a 56-year-old Kamal Khadan who had gathered about 20 members of his extended family in a long salon. While we sat on cushions on the floor, listening to Khadan's story of escape, his grandchildren played in a corner of the room with pieces of Israeli mortars and flares that had exploded nearby. Khadan said he and 30 members of his family had watched from their windows as their neighbors attempted to flee, only to fall under the intensifying shelling. For the next 3 hours, they remained inside until the bombardment grew even stronger, shaking the walls of the house. "They fired every kind of weapon at us and bombed us indiscriminately," he said. "Finally, we decided to go out and pray to God we would arrive safely to a hospital." End quote. The ICRC and the Palestinian Red Crescent had been barred from entering eastern Rafah by the Israeli military, so the Khadans were left to find their own way to sanctuary. Kamal Khadan said he ordered his family into the road and instructed them to walk in a straight line towards Yusuf al-Najjar Hospital in central Rafah, the only major medical facility in town. However, the shelling on the main road grew so intense the family had to change course. Quote, "We could see tall buildings totally leveled," Khadan said. Quote, "People were being shelled, their bodies flying into pieces right in front of our eyes. We survived because God watched over us. We were running blindly. We just wanted to survive. We were running like insane people. We weren't thinking about anything." End quote. Miraculously, the Khadan family arrived at al-Najjar Hospital without losing a single family member. But they were not safe yet. Quote, "The moment we got to the hospital and could catch our breath," Kamal Khadan said, "Israel called the hospital and said they were going to bomb it." End quote. "The condition in the hospital was disastrous," he continued. "It was full of wounded patients and martyrs. The Israelis insisted on bombing the hospital, so we evacuated and left the dead bodies. It was such a heinous scene, such a hideous scene. I cannot even put it into words. It was insane. We were waiting, and the hospital was begging the Israelis to delay, to give us some time to evacuate and get the wounded out. The whole time, ambulances were rushing to the hospital with large numbers of injured people. Some of the ambulances arriving at that time had been attacked." End quote. With the sound of exploding bombs growing closer, Khadan and his family escaped again, to his brother's house in eastern Rafah, where they remained for the next 3 days. Khadan told me he did not seek shelter in the UNRWA school because Israeli had begun shelling those too. There was no sanctuary anywhere in the Gaza Strip, not in United Nations operated schools, nor in hospitals. According to the UNRWA, by Saturday, August 2nd, the Israeli military had attacked a full third of Gaza's hospitals, along with 14 primary healthcare clinics and 29 ambulances belonging to either the Red Crescent or the Ministry of Health. This next section is titled "The Cooler." As the dead and wounded descended on tiny Kawadi Hospital, the duty of imposing order on the impossibly chaotic situation fell to Samir Holmes, the hospital's 67-year-old director. He was no stranger to violence. The Israeli army killed his father when he was 6 months old and his first son during the Second Intifada. Still, he told me Black Friday was like nothing he had ever witnessed. Quote, "Out of 20 hours we were treating patients, I was running for 15 hours, not walking," he told me in his office on the second floor, speaking in the passable English he honed during a medical stint in the United States. Quote, "Every floor was covered with wounded patients. We were treating the injured in dental chairs, doing surgery on the ground, doing anything we could to save people." End quote. In normal times, Kawadi Hospital serves 2 or 3 cases a day, usually older women. Our colleagues weren't used to seeing bodies that were 70% burned or decapitated heads, Holmes explained, when one of the hospital's nurses, Karam Dair, arrived among the dead, torn in half by a drone missile. Holmes said several of her female co-workers fell to the ground in grief. This next photo shows Dr. Samir Holmes of Kawadi Hospital in Rafah beside an ice cream cooler where dead children were stored on Black Friday. This is a photo of the hospital cooler. Continuing. As the dead bodies continued to be piled throughout the day, Holmes was forced to send for ice cream coolers and vegetable refrigerators from local shops. It was in coolers normally used to preserve food that Gaza-based journalist Mohammed Amir reported that he saw, quote, the corpses of children, young men, and women lying on top of one another, soaked in blood. Many were impossible to identify, and only a few had been placed in white burial shrouds. End quote. In one ice cream cooler laid the corpses of several infant children tightly wrapped in white sheets. While shrapnel caused most of the wounds Holmes treated, he described treating patients for unusual injuries that suggested that Israel was using experimental weaponry. They consisted of 1 mm entry wounds that did negligible damage to the skin or skeleton, but left widespread burns on the internal organs of the patients, usually leading to the deaths within 2 or 3 days. The wounds Holmes described to me were telltale signs of dense inert metal explosives, or DIME, and experimental munitions that generates high-intensity explosions in a concentrated area. Since 2006, doctors in Gaza have documented unusual injuries suggesting the weapon's use by the Israeli military against civilians. Though the worst was over by the time we went with him, Holmes said all supply lines to his overwhelmed hospital remained blocked. Quote, they are just hunting us, and everyone is a target, no matter who they are, Holmes sighed. We love peace, and we want dignity, but the Israelis won't allow us to practice these things. End quote. This next section is called the Fog of Holy War. Having reduced Kazaa, Beit Hanun, and eastern Rafah to ash and rubble, Colonel Winter was back in Israel on August 10th for a concert arranged to honor his Givati brigade. When Winter learned that a female singer, Sarit Haddad, would perform before his troops, however, he announced his objection on religious grounds, prompting her replacement by a male singer. Yet, when religious soldiers from the Givati brigade followed suit, attempting a protest walkout over the presence of a female musician in the army band backing the male singer, Winter was compelled to issue orders forbidding them from leaving the auditorium. A graduate of B'nai David Yeshiva in the religious nationalist settlement of Eli, which has sent at least 50 commissioned officers into the Israeli army, the Givati Brigade's Winter channeled the attitudes of young citizen soldiers rising through the ranks of the military. The hero of a generation, Winter returned from a battlefield to bask in adulation from his countrymen. On August 15th, Yedoath Aronoth, the country's most influential paper, published a lengthy interview with the commander, noting, quote, Winter cannot walk around today without being stopped by passerbys on the street, hugged, asked for a photo opportunity. According to the newspaper, quote, there is no officer currently in the army who is admired as Winter is. Continuing, The interview highlighted Winter's unabashed Jewish fundamentalism, recalling a mission to destroy several rows of civilian homes in Kuza, where Palestinian fighters had supposedly taken shelter. Winter conjured a hallucinatory vision of godly intervention. Quote, "We were protected by clouds of divine honor," he exclaimed. Quote, "We, all the warriors, were suddenly covered by a heavy fog, which came with us throughout the attack." End quote. Asked about the orders he gave after Golden's capture, Winter freely admitted to invoking the Hannibal Directive. Quote, "I announced on the communication system the word that no one wants to say, Hannibal." Winter told his interviewer, quote, "In other words, there had been an abduction. I instructed all the forces to move forward, to occupy space, so that the abductors would not be able to move." End quote. Winter then boasted of the violence he ordered, declaring, quote, "We shredded them. We can do it much worse, and it's best for them that we not do it. We gave them a much stronger beating than in Castlead," referencing Operation Castlead, which killed 1,400 civilians and 350 children back in 2008 to 2009. The Givati commander held the civilian population of Gaza, those whom he had cast as blasphemers against God, responsible for their suffering. Quote, "In almost every home, there is a son or other relative that is a partner in terror," Winter remarked. Quote, "How do you raise children in a home with explosives? In the end, everyone gets what they choose." End quote. They were all, every last one, even the children, enemies, deserving to die. The 51-day war elevated the status of fundamentalist warriors like Winter and electrified militant nationalist elements on the home front. Back in Israel, in cities from Tel Aviv to Haifa to Jerusalem, the right wing pressed its attack against those they identified as enemies within. This photo is of a banner in Israel that says, "Winning is possible. Shut off Gaza's electricity, gas, food. Yes, it is moral." And this photo was taken by journalist David Sheen. And that's the end of chapter 8. So we did chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8 yesterday. We did the introduction, chapters 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, I hope you learned something today, tonight. I hope you enjoy the rest of your nights. Power to the people, and free Palestine.